put in an hour to an hour and a half a week studying, I might, but I'm not very hopeful about it.
So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this radical thinking workshop that Will and I are doing. A couple housekeeping things on the front end. Will and I are leading this together, although Will really was primary in putting together the PowerPoint presentation. If you have a question, I would appreciate it if you would raise your hand or shoot me a text in the chat box. We'll periodically look at that and take a pause in our workshop and answer questions along the way. We have about 15 to 17 people who've registered for this. So if it were smaller, we would just have an interactive session. But since we have so many people that did register, if you could send a chat with your questions or comments, that would be appreciated. Most of you probably know Will, but I want to give a little background on him. Will has been in the social sector since 2006. He's really been active. He actually was the president of Delaware Grantmakers Association before it became Philanthropy Delaware. He's been CFO of a large nonprofit in Delaware. He's also been a board member of Christiana Care Health System and served on committees there. Really done a lot of work, strategic thinking, a lot of work in the finance area, which is one of his areas of expertise. He helped Dana with building a model, the cash flow model, that's been used for the PPP loans, and did the webinar on guidelines on how to use that and how to use a cash flow model. He also is heavily involved, active with the Rotary Club of Wilmington. So thanks, Will, for leading this with me. I work at Dana. I don't know how many of you know much of my background. Half of it's in business and half of it's in the nonprofit sector. So I've been a general manager of a manufacturing company, ran the operations section for Hewlett-Packard's direct fulfillment program for custom configured computers for the United States for 2.5 years. Was a director of quality, Lean Six Sigma guy, and then I became an executive director in the nonprofit sector and worked for Prison Fellowship Ministries for 7+ years and kind of brought that expertise into the nonprofit sector. So that's kind of my background. Will, why don't you go ahead and kick us off? I'll keep watching the waiting room and let people in as they come.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you everybody who has joined us today. Let me tell you what we're going to tell you as one does. Paul and I will be sharing responsibility for exposing content and our thoughts. And again, if you do have a comment or a question, please use that chat room. I know Paul joins me in wishing that we were all together in one place so that we could see each other's faces and read one another's nonverbals and interact more directly. So today we're going to begin by talking about why Paul and I think radical thinking is needed. And later on, you'll see that we have grabbed onto a fairly well-trodden path about how you do radical thinking. And we're going to talk about how you plan for it. We think that preparation helps produce better results. We've actually reversed the next two bullets. We're going to talk about mission and knowing your organization. And then we're going to focus pretty intensively on rediscovering your customer. I'm going to unapologetically use that term customer, knowing that it is not as commonly used in the social service sector as perhaps I make it sound, but I hope you'll be comfortable enough with it that it won't get in the way of our exploration. We're going to look at the market environment in which your organizations are going to be operating. We'll talk about how you create planning scenarios. It's a term we use a lot. It is more than a notion that we can accomplish in the time we have, but we can at least set some ideas in your head about how you can create planning scenarios. We'll spend some time talking about setting up creative thinking because it's essential in our view to being successful in the time that we are living through. We'll talk about prototyping, which is a way of taking your creative thinking and making it real at a relatively low cost. And then, of course, the importance of assessing the results of your prototyping and your planning. So why did we think we should be engaging in radical thinking? Some of the motivation, I confess, came out of personal feelings. And you may have had the same ones. It's hearing myself say, oh, I can't wait to get back to going to the restaurant that I love, get back to seeing my grandchildren, get back to, and it was during this time of stress and fear and discomfort, that instinct to want to get back is almost overpowering. And we forget that as a result of what is going on around us, the world in which we live has changed. And the customer whom we serve, the client, the member, the audience, that person has been changed by what's going on in the world. Unless you're very fortunate, the organization that you lead or serve has also changed. Some organizations may have lost key employees.
So Will, can I jump in here just a second?
Yeah, sure.
This is part of our tag team thing. When we say the customer has changed, it's easy to say, well, I serve seniors, and no, they haven't changed. We're still serving seniors. But I think part of what Will and I are talking about is this is a mindset shift. So all of a sudden they're thinking, I can't get out. I can't do the things that I did before. So all of a sudden they're thinking in a totally different way, even though it's the same person. And so what we're trying to get at is these changes have happened to us whether we've liked it or not. And now how do we drill down and recognize that this radical thinking is what we've got to do because these changes have come regardless.
Exactly, Paul, thank you. The commonplace is change is hard, change is difficult, we know that. And we earnestly believe that the critical ingredient to being successful, to transitioning into the new future is innovation and creativity. It's breaking free of patterns from the past and thinking in new ways, hence radical thinking. Paul, you want to talk a little bit about planning for radical thinking, and I'll jump in when I get called.
Will made this slide, and I loved his mise en place. Putting things in place, those of you who cook or bake, putting all your ingredients on the table really is an important part of that, measured correctly so that you don't have to sit there and guess with it. And so I think all of these things are part of the mise en place. And so who's in the room? It really does matter who is in the room. Do we have board members in the room? Do we have program people in the room? Do we have the leaders in the room? Do we have the customer in the room? Do we have potential customers in the room? Those people matter because they're looking through, if I could borrow a prop here, they're looking through different lenses than you are. So when they see the problem or they see the opportunity, they're looking at a totally different set of lenses than you are. Collection of data. What do you want to know? What's important to know? Did we gather stuff in the past that now no longer really is as relevant as new things that we need to gather? Thinking about that. What should we be gathering? Work sessions. I like this one. Be comfortable, work fast, but don't rush. You might go, wait a minute, work fast and don't rush? What does that mean? What I think it means is be thoughtful and put things in place and say, yes, we've got to make, there has to be some momentum here. We have to drive to make some change because change is happening around us. But we don't want to go so fast that we miss thoughtful reflection on what it means, what's really happening. So I think we do need to work fast, but not rush through so that we miss things that are important. And finally, what do you need to support creative thinking? If I were to throw things on the table, I don't know how many of you know David Kubacki. He is one of our Dana consultants, and he does strategic planning with Legos. Personally, I have done that. And what's been fascinating is in the group, he came and did it with Dana, and he basically said, now take this standard set of Legos, all of you have the same Legos, and I want you to solve this problem, build something that shows your solution. And we all built something, and they were all totally different. And then each person said, and this little tail reflects this. And all of a sudden we started thinking in ways that were totally different than we had thought in the past. So what do you need to support creative thinking? Whiteboard, Post-it notes. I want all of you to write down 5 things that you think are important. And now let's put them all up on the whiteboard and, oh, let's sort them. And all the pink ones are over here because they all signify they deal with this area. What things do you need to support creative thinking? Will, what would you unpack?
I would simply say that there are, as a result of so many of us working remotely now, we happen to be on Zoom now, but Slack and Google Meet all have tools to facilitate collaborative creativity. None of them is as good as having everybody in the room, but if you plan your work ahead, you can make sure that the people whom you have brought together, when you have the right people, are familiar with the tools you're going to use to facilitate capturing creative thoughts.
So here's a great example of me not doing what I should have done up front. And that is to say, is there anyone who's not familiar with how to put a chat in the chat box? So this is technology that not everybody has used. And I really should have set that up on the front end and said, if you run your cursor down at the bottom, you'll see a little box that says chat. You can click on that and you can send me a question or a comment. Upendo just tested it and it works. Thank you.
So I'm going to let Paul continue, ask Paul to continue here, but in all of my life in the service sector, the first question that I have asked is, what's your mission? If you are as old as I am and your management education began with Peter Drucker, then you would have read Peter Drucker saying, what business are we in? It's the fundamental question. Paul, take it away.
Yeah, those of you that know me and have heard me in any forum have probably gotten tired of me hearing me say, most of us talk about what we do with our mission rather than why we do what we do. And to borrow Simon Sinek's phrase, people do not buy what you do, they buy why you do it, which is really the impact that you have. We change people's lives. Here's how we change people's lives, rather than we offer programs that do this. Well, that's the what. So when I talk to people about their mission, I love Simon Sinek's work, and those of you who've not heard it, you really ought to spend the 18 minutes to look at his TED Talk, Start With Why. He discovered the really great leaders started with why, and movements happened. And I just want to highlight that because there's brain science behind it. You make decisions in the limbic portion of your brain, which is where behavior and emotion reside. And if you can touch someone with a story, having impact, storytelling to have impact. We've had another workshop about that. If you can touch people emotionally and say, here's why we do what we do, we change lives. They've already made the decision to join you. You may not even have to ask them. But when you look at funding, when you look at, thanks, Seth, I appreciate your including that. He put the link in the chat box to everyone. If you've not looked at that, you really ought to copy that down. So that's impact. That's talking about the whole reason my raison d'etre is to change lives. And now how do I measure it? Kids coming out of poverty, kids succeeding, graduation rates, health rates, all of those things, the areas that you work in, that's mission, understanding mission. Will, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm sure it's clear to everyone, but we start with the mission because the temptations as the world changes around us, and particularly, and you've all faced this dilemma, I know, at some point in your lives in the social service sector, where you have the opportunity to claim some resources if you just take on a new thing. And if you're not grounded in your mission, in what it is that you intend to accomplish, you can find yourself wandering afield and spending limited resources to accomplish less than you could if you had focused and stayed sharply and intensely focused on your mission. So we urge you to start with mission. The next area of discussion, and we're imagining that you are taking some part of what we're discussing and you're actually working with a group whom you've assembled. And so we're imagining some conversations. And to us, after mission, the most important question is, who is our primary customer? Whom do we serve? And our simple definition is that the primary customer is the person whose life you change through your work. Now, there is a whole area of inquiry in which we would move and say, you also have supporting customers, funders, or in some cases, if your primary customer is a child, there are parents or caregivers. But the focus, and usually the way in which you will measure your results, is going to be by change that occurs to your primary customer. And so being clear about who that is at the outset is very important. And again, recognizing that the world has changed, your primary customer has changed. So the next question is, what does your primary customer need? What is it that the customer wants from you? And how might that need change, or how might that need have changed over the months in which we've been experiencing the coronavirus pandemic? The obvious case that will come to everybody's mind, I suppose, are children who have to learn remotely, or workers who are able to work remotely. But depending on who your customer is, they have experienced the coronavirus pandemic in different ways, and they are different people, and what they want has changed. And Paul alluded earlier to the possibility of having the customer in the room when you are doing the work that you are doing. If you're going to do radical thinking, The best way to know what your customer values and what they need is to be in conversation with the customer. And there are obvious logistical challenges and so on, but if you can have the customer's voice alive in your discussions, you can have greater confidence that you are understanding them as they have been shaped by the events of the last several months. So obviously the next question is, how will your customer, the life of your customer, be changed by what you do? What does the customer, what do you believe that the customer values about the service you provide? This is especially important because we're going to ask you to look at perhaps responding to that desired value in new ways. Your hope will be that you can satisfy that customer's need in a way that is efficient and effective, but may be very different from the way you did 6 months ago. So focusing on the value that the customer gets from your service rather than the service itself will help you to loosen up your thinking about how you deliver on your promise to the customer.
Here's one real quick, if I could just jump in there.
Sure, Paul.
From a medical standpoint, I hate sitting in doctor's offices and waiting to be seen. And inevitably, when you're there, that happens. I want you to know that it's changed with this whole telehealth thing. I actually had a Zoom call where I was scheduled at 2:30 to have a doctor's appointment. And at 2:30 they came on, we handled the call, boom, we were done. But I knew that was scheduled at that time, and it really happened a lot faster. So what did I value? Not having to go there, not having to sit in the waiting room, wait for a half an hour for a window to open up because they're having a chat in the back room. Sometimes you need a chat, but you get where I'm coming from. So what did I value? That fast turnaround, being able, the convenience of being able to have that service delivered to me very quickly and on time.
And again, making the implicit explicit, what we're urging that you do is to separate yourself from the service you have always provided and think about what value your customer derived from the service or is seeking from the services you can provide. This gets really interesting if you're in the cultural arts, if you're in the performing arts. What is it that the customer seeks from their performing arts experience? What is the essence of that? So that you can be, as you consider what you can do with changed circumstances, you can be sure that you're providing that value.
Before we go on, here's one for the performing arts. What am I wanting am I wanting my child to learn a skill, or am I wanting to see my child perform? Those are two very different values that your customer may have, and you may need to work both of them, but thinking through those is a really helpful exercise. I also would say, who's in the room? We talked a little bit about that earlier, and I want to inject another thought. I've actually seen organizations where, well, this is our programming, this is what we do, and they have agreed that if everyone is in agreement, one person is designated as the one who disagrees. So all of a sudden now, why is this a bad idea? I have to take that mantle on. Even if I don't think it's a bad idea, I need to start thinking from the lens, the perspective of this won't work because. Here's a downside to it. So all of a sudden you get some diverse thinking based on who's in the room. Upendo wanted us to go back real quickly and talk about measuring results. I would point you also to a webinar that we had last week, I think it was, on outcomes and talking about measuring results there. But really, we're measuring the change that you're desiring to see happen. So capturing data that points to that change is really what measuring the outcomes is about. Is that helpful?
Thank you, Paul. The next set of questions or area that we believe needs careful and disciplined exploration is, what do we need to know about our organization? Paul, you want to take this one?
Sure. Jim Collins, we, back in 2015, had him come out to our annual conference and speak, and he did good to great, those of you who are old enough to remember that. And part of his focus was, what are we best at, what are we passionate about, and what's our resource engine drive? And it really was the intersection of those three circles that made companies great. I think the same thing is true with nonprofits. We can actually be involved in so many programs that we become too diverse and diffuse our efforts and say, what are we best at? How do we focus on that? And what are we passionate about? And what's our resource engine? So those of you who are math oriented or may remember Venn diagrams, it's those circles, and it's the intersection of those three circles that's a sweet spot. I also want to talk about assets too. When we normally think of assets, we think of things like computers, office space, tools that we've got. But I want you to think beyond that framework, because your board is an asset, for example. What does your board bring to the table that no one else brings? That's an asset. They bring value that they have connections in the community that nobody else has. What do your customers bring to the table? I guarantee you that your clients have relationships that you don't have. And if you can capture that, if you can work with them, you can actually look at them as an asset, count on that asset, and actually develop more of what you do.
Paul, let me see, there we go. Can always count on at least one good screen freeze in every live presentation. The next area of inquiry, and I'll just briefly touch on, is understanding the market environment. We talk here about the need for services, which is driven by the customer, but also in terms of when we think about the market environment, we mean as well the organizations that may be your partners and the organizations that may be your competitors. There is, and some of you may be in this field, there is a constellation of organizations that provide after-school activities for young people. And they are not all going to survive the challenges of the pandemic. If you are in that field, it's important to know who's still out there, who could you potentially collaborate with, whose customers might no longer be receiving services, who are potentially new customers for you. So some time can profitably be spent in looking at the world in which you're going to be operating in the future, or which you are likely to be operating today, and getting a sense of what's out there.
Will, if you could go back, this 90 days, 120 days.
Yeah.
That whole thing is important too.
Oh, thank you.
Because
yep.
as we go into this, the first 30 days, I'll be honest with you, when we hit this pandemic, Dana's response to this was, oh my goodness, what are our members going to need 2 weeks from now? We need to create that so that they have it right now, because right now they're in shock. They may not even know what they need. We need to be thinking ahead. So when you think of timeframes and you think of the services that you offer, the question is, what's the immediate need right now? How will that change in 90 days? What will it look like 6 months from now? Because that impacts how we do what we do, the way we deliver service. It impacts the value of our service. it impacts what they may need and what they may want. So I just wanted to reframe that again, that it really, looking over time is important.
Thank you. I'm going to guess that many of you have done some form of scenario planning, and there are many ways to approach it. We're just going to sketch out in a very simple way a beginning of thinking in terms of scenarios. The object of scenario planning is to frame possibilities into a recognizable whole that allow you then to contain your creative thinking within some boundaries. It's necessary to have guardrails in effect, and the scenarios provide that structure, those guardrails that help you to focus your creative thinking. To me, the first step in scenario planning is putting a name on the uncertainties that are causing you discomfort. So this is a discipline. It's, you know, how many times have any of us been lying awake in the middle of the night and our brains just flow with worry and they keep cycling over and over again? Well, one of the learned skills in addressing that kind of challenge is to put a name to what those worries are. And what we're suggesting that you do here is taking a look at the world around you, those things you cannot control, identify what are the driving, the big scary uncertainties, the things you cannot control. So the most obvious is the course of this coronavirus. Another uncertainty is how local or state government is going to respond. But you can, in your own mind, begin right now to identify what those uncertainties, the big ones, are. And as I said, put a name to them, write them down. Same thing with internal uncertainties. You've got questions, depending on your organization, about capacities that you formerly had and you may not have in the future. You may have employees who will choose not to return to your organization as a result of fear of the becoming infected. But same thing, build a list of what those uncertainties are, and then begin to assemble those into alternative futures. There is no one accurate scenario, but the more you identify possible scenarios, the more likely you are to anticipate what will actually happen. So develop a set of scenarios that are likely to be dominated by one of the big uncertainties. So there will be a scenario in which you will say, there is a resurgence of the coronavirus in October of 2020. That's the resurgence scenario. There's another scenario in which you would say there is a vaccine that is available in the first quarter of 2021. Scenario 2. You can build scenarios that are unrelated to coronavirus, depending upon what are the driving uncertainties for your work. But the idea is, without filling in every detail of the scenario, you're beginning to cluster your uncertainties into 3, 4 possible scenarios with varying assumptions about the big uncertainties. And what I recommend is when you get those identified and they begin to have a shape, you step back and assess each one for what your group believes is the probability that this will be what the reality is. Some scenarios may, when you all put your heads together, seem highly unlikely, in which case, don't spend a lot of time on that, or don't start with that. Start with what your group of thinkers says, you know, that we all believe this is where we are going to be 3, 6, 9 months from now. Do the same exercise, though, with respect to risk. That is, if this scenario occurs, we'll be okay. We can do fine. It'll be tough, we'll struggle, but we can still meet our customers' needs and be sustainable. On the other hand, if scenario F occurs, we're sunk. We don't see right now how we can meet our mission, serve our customers under these circumstances. You may, and we are going to say pick one, I would say the one you think is most likely, but you may also choose to pick the one that is the biggest risk and make that the starting point, the framework for your creative thinking.
I would also, before you go on here, one thing that's not on the slide that I think we ought to consider is, what is it that you're actually delivering to the customer in light of those risks? And in those scenarios, how could we deliver it differently? Because all of a sudden you're thinking about those different scenarios, the external uncertainties. I'll give you a great example. They didn't know when you could congregate, so Opera Delaware. Oh my goodness, we can't have live performances. So they began to think, what is it that we deliver to our customer? Well, classical opera, so let's have drive-by arias. And they began to do that. So they're thinking of these scenarios, these uncertainties, and they're developing, what is it that we deliver to the customer? How can we deliver it in this environment? So it's, again, stating the obvious, it's looking at what you're actually delivering and how can I now do that based on these uncertainties.
So Paul, some of you may be familiar with the concepts of design thinking. A lot of what we're calling radical thinking is embedded in this process. Do you want to kind of take people through it?
Sure, just raise your hand if you're familiar with design thinking. Anybody? Kat? Okay. So there are actually a lot of breadth in the whole concept of design thinking. There are some models that have 3 steps, some models that have up to 12 steps. The one that we're actually identifying here has 5. And these are just steps that you would walk through that you will help you think differently and design what it is that you deliver. So first of all, empathizing with your users. What is it they're feeling? How can we address that felt need that they have with our solution? Define what their needs are, what the problem is, what's keeping them, keeping you from delivering on that. Gather all the insights that you can, and then all of a sudden, throw out some challenging assumptions, create ideas, innovative solutions. What if we did this? What if we had drive-by arias? What if we had performances in the parking lot? All of a sudden, those then address the felt needs, the defined problem, and now you're actually trying it out, prototyping, start creating solutions. Actually, try one out, the next one test. You're actually saying, hey, let's put our foot in the water and see if this works. You'll note that those of you who've been following Opera Delaware and the Grand, they actually did drive-by arias, and they're actually doing it again. So it has worked. So testing solutions. Again, note that the 5 phases, stages aren't always sequential. You're going to go back and forth. You're going to try something, it won't work, go back, look at your assumptions again, redefine what the needs are, so you're actually flow through these. Those of you who have experience with design thinking, I love to involve insights from those who attend. Anyone have anything they want to share? Kat? Kay? So, if not?
So just to place these ideas in your minds, that what we're suggesting, and you can see in Paul's explication of design thinking, is embedded in our radical thinking process. And the critical part is the willingness to think differently and challenge your basic assumptions. And you can see now, I hope, the importance of having the right people in the room, about having an environment that stimulates creativity. And we're urging organizations to take the time to go through this process, recognizing, again, as we said at the beginning, the tremendous force of just wanting to get back and to get open or to keep doing what we did. So the urging here is to set aside time to follow a process such as we've suggested, or to get formal and do a design thinking exercise. Paul, you want to talk about root causes?
Sure, root causes, this comes out of my, so Kat's adding something. My only point to add to this is the importance of design thinking process being well facilitated. Absolutely. So that actually was going to be part of what we would say at the end of this. This really is an introduction, and maybe an introduction to do this kind of presentation with your board, and then say, now let's do it as an organization. So facilitating this, having somebody from the outside being able to ask the tough questions, that the elephant's in the room, but nobody wants to talk about it. Well, an outsider can talk about it easier than somebody who's part of the organization. Identifying root causes. This comes out of my quality background, Lean Six Sigma background. And we usually use it in process improvement, quality control, to identify causes of problems. And the best way to describe this is by way of a manufacturing environment, if I could. Here's the example I use frequently. We were unable to ship an order from the warehouse. Why is that? Why did we fail to ship the order? Well, because we didn't have any inventory in stock. Well, why didn't we have any inventory in stock? Because we didn't know that we were going to run out. Well, why didn't we know we were going to run out? Well, we didn't have a reorder point, a minimum reorder point. Well, if we established a reorder point, how would we know that? You know, all of a sudden you now have a bin, and when we get to 5, there's a little card in there that says reorder. You're never going to have that problem again. So that's for solving problems. But I would suggest to you that root cause analysis is, we had a gala that far exceeded our expectations this year. Ask 5 whys. Why did it exceed our expectations? What was different this year than any other year? Why was that? Well, we did more marketing than we ever did before. Why did we do that? Well, we had the budget. So that means we're going to need to set aside money next year for the budget for marketing. Why else did it work? So all of a sudden you drill down into what succeeded, why it succeeded, and you really find root causes so that you can reproduce that success. Does that make sense to everybody?
Thanks, Paul. If you had asked me several months ago about ideation, I would have gagged. I just hate the word. But that said, this is what we mean when we talk about ideation. It's the creative process. And as I said earlier, it needs some guardrails, but you also, again, if you've prepared properly, this is this is where people working together with different perspectives, different lenses, as Paul said, are better than one person sitting alone, even in nature, inspired by bird song, sunlight, and flowing water. This is where some discipline, but engaging with a group of people can produce a more creative and effective result. So the ideation process is that we're suggesting, and again, it can be facilitated and perhaps should be, is picking one of those scenarios you identified, combining, looking at one of your customers' high priority needs, what you believe is critically important to your customer, and then asking yourself, how many different ways can your organization meet that need under the conditions of the scenario that you're working on? And clearly you're going to iterate, you're going to go from one scenario to another. You will carry what you learned in doing one exercise like this into the next. But eventually you will come up with a potential response. It may be a new service, it may be an activity, it may be an investment of some kind, but you are going to then step back and say, okay, what would have to be true for this idea, this service to work? And you'll test those ideas and rank them, and eventually you'll come up with an idea that you want to actually try. One of the ways in which, in my experience, the social service sector differs from the profit-seeking sector is the challenge that we often have in innovating. And the concept of prototyping, I think, is a potential answer to that challenge. And what we suggest is that you have developed a potential response to the changed circumstances under one of the scenarios that you've defined to meet a customer need. How can that potential service or response be tested on a small scale at low cost very quickly? So we're urging organizations to devote time to thinking about how can we find out if what we think is true actually meets the customer's needs, and try it in the marketplace fast, fail early, determine whether or not it is successful, and then seek investment and grow the service further. I think too often we feel like in our world, it's all or nothing. And what we're suggesting is that in times like these, with a rapidly changing and challenging environment, learning how to prototype, how to create a small test and get to market with that test is a critical skill. And recognizing that not every idea is going to be successful.
I would go back to the measure results too that Upendo brought up. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. That is a critical part of this. What change is it that we're trying to bring about? How do we capture data that actually measures that change? Because that's an important reality check as to whether the prototype worked or not.
This is another way of expressing what we're talking about in prototyping. Paul, you want to talk about firing bullets than cannonballs?
Yeah, this came out of Jim Collins' work, Great by Choice. And he basically was saying organizations, corporations had a tendency to go all in. We're going to head this new direction. And he said the really successful ones actually did the prototype work. They fired a bullet, they calibrated it, they got it on target, they adjusted how they delivered the service, how they delivered the product, and then they said, this really worked, and now let's fire the cannonballs. So they didn't go all in and spend a lot of money on a big program until they'd actually calibrated what they were doing. And that's all we're saying here, is you need to be able to have proven results from a prototype. And now that you've proven it, now let's go whole hog and really invest in this.
So we have covered in a highly abstracted way a process that we are hoping you and your organizations will want to take the time to develop so that you are applying the creative energy which is present in all of us to thinking in new ways about how to meet the needs of the people whom you serve under these very challenging conditions that we are all operating under, and to pause, recognizing that the work is going to start again. People are going to return to something that resembles what they did before, but recognizing that in the long run, the world is different and we need to begin and make time to think differently about it right now. Paul?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming, and to reiterate Kat's earlier point about facilitation. This really is a framework we've talked about, but walking through this kind of process with you and your team is something we can do with you to help you, and then actually develop it into an engagement to say, how do we actually execute these scenarios? How do we create these scenarios? How do we walk through prototyping, testing it, and walking it out? So thank you all. Any comments or questions? We have a few minutes left. We're 5 minutes early in our close time. Any comments or questions that you have? Kat?
Hey, yeah, the one thought that I had as you guys were working through the framework was truly radical, I think, would be doing this with other nonprofits together. Like, I think we're getting to, that place where, like, when you were saying, like, first start with mission, I was thinking about, like, starting with the problem set. Not just like, what do I do, but like, what are we trying to solve? And like, who else does that too, or wants to do that too?
Or has a peripheral side thing that actually contributes to that.
Right. Exactly. So, I think, yeah, that was just one of the resounding thoughts I had, was just how important it is for us to truly get radical, is to start thinking beyond the boundaries of our own nonprofits and our existing financial structures and existing organizations, and start moving to a place of thinking about the problem, and how we can also let go of the things that we've been doing before, and identify the highest value strategies that can solve that problem. And to that point too, on design thinking, making sure that we're bringing our clients into the design thinking experience too, that we're not the ones that are likely going to know the right solution. So not just the interviewing and the empathy, but how do we actually get them into the design of the solution too? So totally on board with all the design thinking and the prototyping, and thinking about how we all do it together.
Thanks.
Yeah, good points. Thanks, Kat. Anyone else? Steve? You really don't have to say anything if you don't have anything to add. I appreciated your note.
Okay, thanks, Paul. This has been mind blowing, and really, I'm really rethinking that as an organization, we might even have to tweak our mission a little bit, because as Will already said, the world has changed and it's not changing back. Or we hope it will, but I don't really think it's going to happen. and you know, if you, because like our mission was people driven, and if you're not going to get to the people, it's about time you got to think about how you serve your customer away from them. So yeah, I mean, it's really challenging my mind right now, but thanks for all this.
You're welcome. So I would say in closing that we evaluate our workshops and webinars every time we do it. So I'm going to send out an evaluation. Would appreciate your feedback, the good, the bad, the ugly. We like to know what worked and what didn't work. And if you could help us with that, we'd appreciate it greatly. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
you.